order. Brittany, do you need to take attendance?
That is a good question. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
All right. We'll go through and do that. All right. Stephanie Sutton.
Here.
Christian Newman.
Present.
Bob Ackerman.
You're on mute, Bob.
I'm here.
Gotcha. Thank you. James Blythe, I believe, is absent. Thomas Hawkins.
I am here.
Sophia Corrigetto is absent, and Jason Hurst, I believe, is absent.
Okay, and so moving forward.
We also have our school board member on the line with us tonight as well, Tina Certain.
Great. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Certain. I know you've been very busy lately.
Crazy. This is my 5th Zoom today.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here. So just for board members, I'm going to keep sort of the participant list up. I don't believe the chat is enabled, but if you would like to speak or ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye on that. I believe they're going to go through sort of one chapter at a time, and we'll have board discussion, and then we'll open it up for public comment after each topic. So with that, Andrew, I don't know if you're going to do an introduction or if HRNA is just going to jump right in.
I'll do a brief introduction and then I'll turn it over to Lydia and her team. Well, here we are. I wanted to use this chance to thank everybody for the work, both at the staff level as well as the plan board and some of the past meetings we've had, and for reviewing the work to date so far. I was looking back through the annals of city history on Legistar and found the original resolution that the commission passed back in November of 2019, which I think sort of set the groundwork for the meeting and the work that we are here tonight to discuss. And that resolution, I think, is really critical because it set at a commission level that race and racial equity was going to be at the forefront and a core organizing principle of this plan. And so it is not a typical plan, as you probably have seen from the first few chapters. This is not a plan like any other in the state of Florida, but I think it is a growing trend in the country to really directly address the longstanding disparities in communities between those members who have benefited from the large expanse of American history and those who have not. And so you've read through some of the drafts and you can see that a lot of the language is very direct. And that is something that we want to sort of talk a little bit about tonight. You can see some of the structure is different, and we've sort of talked a little bit about that. I don't want to necessarily sort of belabor, some of these things that we're going to talk about, but I do really kind of want to highlight that I think we are breaking a lot of ground here, both as a city, a community, and the work that we're doing. I'm excited to hear your thoughts about making these drafts better. I'm excited for the next series of workshops we're going to have with you on different chapters as we get closer to discussing the commission at a workshop format. I did want to mention that these are not any sort of formal sort of adoption hearings. These are really just for us to have a conversation about the work to date, to get the plan board and then ultimately the commission feedback, so that can be incorporated. We are also posting all of these chapters on the city's Conveo website, which allows for citizens or residents or neighbors to go on and to comment on the entire draft and capture their comments. It's one of the many ways that we're trying to do public engagement a little bit differently with this plan than past plans or any other type of engagement that's going on in the city right now. So there will be a long period of time where the public will be encouraged to comment on these plans and on the various draft chapters as we move forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lydia and her team to talk a little bit about framing for tonight and as we go forward. Thanks.
Real quick, and this may be something that they answer, but I just thought about it when you were talking, Andrew. All of those comments, and I think that's great that it's going to be online and people are going to have the opportunity to comment and things. How is that content all going to be relayed to us and the City Commission? Because I can imagine the volume of that is going to be quite overwhelming, but it also might be useful to see the direct comments and not just have it all processed. So maybe we'll talk about that, and that may be an HRNA question more than a city staff question, but that just came to mind as you were talking.
No, that's great, and I can talk a little bit about it, and I know Lydia has an area have some to speak about as well. We've captured all of those things, and Nathaniel has actually compiled all of the raw feedback into a large spreadsheet with everything, and we're actually working through the individual comments and the staff that have been drafting those chapters. So they're working directly with those comments, but we can definitely provide all of the raw comments to you, and I think that would be helpful. We did, in addition to posting all of this document and getting these feedbacks, we had listening sessions with community. We have hired community cultivators, which are neighbors that also did their own outreach and projects. So there's a lot of big volume, as you said, of feedback from the public that we're working to incorporate into the plan.
Great, thank you.
We can dive right in here. I think Andrew said it all on that specific point, and we'd be happy to share it, have everyone sort of view the direct comments to the extent that it's relevant. It's categorized as well by a section in my chapter. So I have a little bit of framing up front to say about the process that we've been through. I've got a couple of brief slides, and then we really want to spend the most of our time this evening on the substance of the chapters. But just to kind of start out, I'm going to share my screen and share a few quick pieces so that we can kind of do a little bit of orientation for ourselves about what we're looking at, what we hope to discuss today, and where we are in this overall process. So first, we'll be talking through, as Andrew sort of introduced, the commission resolution and mandate for this project, a little bit about what we said earlier on a new type of comprehensive plan would do and would include, where we are in the process, and reorienting ourselves to the overall outline of what's meant to be included in a document like this as it's designed today. And then we're going to be spending the majority of our time on this chapter by chapter discussion. And if at any point you all can't see the slides or want me to go slower, feel free to interrupt. This is a quick summary of the resolution that Andrew sort of brought up, where our mandate for this project is to ensure that the comp plan helps city leadership and staff build toward a racially equitable Gainesville. And there were a couple of specific elements that were directly called out in the framing and introduction to articulate a specific definition of race and equity, a clear vision for equitable growth, providing the rationale for making race and equity a foundation of the plan, connecting to current and historical context, and articulating the benefit of addressing race and social equity into the comp plan. In terms of new elements that were required under this mandate, new equity goals and policies for capital investment and for provision of public services. So you'll see that some of this is about capital investment and development. Other types of strategies and discussion have been about public services. Quantifiable community, citywide community indicators of equitable growth being identified and measured over time, reporting annually. So, we've got some indicators and metrics. And then, as this process moves forward with the drafting and refinement, we're planning to release what's called here a plan summary. with clear and simple language highlighting policy changes and policies that relate to race, social equity, and equity analysis and growth strategy. We, throughout this process, have been using inclusive outreach and community engagement to engage underrepresented communities, and kind of inviting city and community collaboration to review the goals and policies as they come out through conversations such as this and on those online and other types of interactive platforms. And the last area of discussion on this, under this mandate, was community stewardship, incorporating the expertise of those who have been most negatively impacted by growth, and continually seeking guidance on policies and investments from community bodies who demonstrate that type of inclusive representation and voice. So these are really some guiding tent poles from this resolution that help to shape this practice and are sort of a foundation for a lot of the content that's in the current drafts right now, from framing to the different types of new elements that have been introduced to how we have gone through a lot of different new types of practices and processes to get to where we are today. This slide, we're recalling some of the original discussion that we had a few months ago about our conclusions from our review of the current comp plan. So in looking at the current comp plan and discussing with city staff and others about where the current comp plan falls short in relation to this mission, we identified a couple of key kind of design principles or design goals. One is to center Black people and underrepresented residents in and throughout Gainesville. Two is to involve the whole city organization. Here we're talking about facilitating greater collaboration and making sure that the strategies speak to each other. And third, generating accountability and action. And in that one, sort of thinking really specifically around not just these are ideas that we want to represent in a comprehensive plan, but that there's enough substantive discussion underneath it around how this would be implemented, what are the implementing mechanisms, how can we sort of fund an approach and an idea such as this. We're being really specific around how these ideas have a pathway to move forward. And in addition to those three ideas, in phases 1 and 2 of this drafting process, roughly sort of throughout 2021 to date, we have further emphasized a couple of more key design points. Identifying and prioritizing the city actions that can advance racial equity. What can the city uniquely do? Creating a shared understanding of racial equity in city decision-making. So how does this affect the decision-making processes? The importance, we talked at length about the importance of collecting data and disaggregated data, which can speak to the specific life outcomes and disparities for different populations. And in this last bullet, outlining the government role in new areas of economic and community development. Sort of thinking about areas of work that the city has not historically played as much of a role in, what can we specifically outline there is the type of action that the city could take, or if the city takes a supportive role, how can this strategy move forward under the leadership of a city partner, a neighborhood organization, et cetera. So those are all some of the things that we've kept in mind throughout this process. And just a reminder of what this process has been to date and where we are right now. Phase 1, roughly spanning the entirety of 2021. Phase 1 and 2 were really about working with city staff, with community members across many different channels to identify major issues and challenges that the city will need to address over the next 10 years, evaluating and prioritizing, then moving into, from that generation of ideas into drafting these draft chapters. And where we are today is sort of moving into this phase 3 of refining what we've got and working toward putting together what this final document will ultimately become. And just to remind ourselves of the different types of structural elements we've talked about so far in a plan like this, the draft chapters will include outcomes and policy priorities, draft success metrics, how are we defining and measuring success? And we talked sort of earlier on in this process about some of the potential bold moves. Then we moved on to drafting the chapter text, which you're seeing today, which includes those revised outcome strategies and indicators, some of the measures for creating accountability and tracking progress. And throughout this process, we've been engaging with city departments, others who work in these areas, but work on these outside of city government, and conducting, as Andrew mentioned, a whole slew of different types of public engagement methods, from meetings to the fellowship that we ran, Conveo and our online interactive platform, using email lists, targeted ads for the first time, that's a first for the city of Gainesville, these decentralized gatherings where we gave community members the power and the tools and resources to bring together their neighbors and have a conversation and submit their feedback to us directly, videos that have been produced in this process, and more. So that's been our work to date. And where we are right now is sort of looking at the final sort of plan chapters. How can we take everything that's come from this process and adjust them to make this the best plan that we can? So our discussion today is on some of the draft chapters. And on the left-hand side here, just to reorient ourselves of the outline of the overall Imagine GNV document. We've got an introduction section that's planned for the final comp plan document, an introduction, and the section called Gainesville Today that's intended to capture some of the discussion that we'll see today about how we got here and where do we have to go in the next 10 years. The chapters, the elements that we're talking about sort of fit within the substance of the plan, a plan for all of Gainesville. And here we're listing 8 different substantive chapters, including one that we're sort of talking about newly, how we build the land development. So this last entry point here is not something that you all have seen in the previous plan board conversation we had, but I wanted to call out that through this process, we've been talking a lot about how the city is planning and supporting growth and development in different ways. Every single chapter sort of includes a lot of thinking around that. And one of the things that we want to do as we move toward the end of finalizing a document such as this is bringing out some of those growth related strategies from the relevant sections and bringing them into a specific chapter that can talk sort of directly about how we build and how we sort of influence things like the land development code directly, which is, as we all know, one of the most important implementing tools for the comprehensive plan. So we've got these 9 substantive chapters followed by an implementation and accountability chapter, which would include some of the things around who is responsible for taking action in support of implementing these strategies and ideas, who would be playing a supportive role to support the implementation, who's holding us accountable to making progress, how are we measuring progress, and a lot of those types of ideas. And the technical appendix is very important. It will include a lot of specific elements that are included in the current comprehensive plan that we don't want to lose, but don't quite fit within the organizing structure of the body of the chapters as they've been redesigned. So we'll be designing several technical appendices that will be a really practical reference for specific use cases, let's say throughout the development process where you want to reference things like levels of service directly. Those technical appendices will be a really important sort of design feature as we think about who's referencing different elements of this plan and for what reason. And just in terms of what we'll be discussing today specifically, we have a draft of the introduction in Gainesville Today in a combined document. And for the substantive chapters, we'll be starting with how we get around, which relates to transportation and mobility. And then we'll move on to our cultural identity, where we talk about arts, culture, and preservation. And then how we learn around public education and how the city, in the city's sort of limited role around the school system can kind of support racial equity in our school systems. And on the right-hand side here, some of the discussion questions that we thought we would bring for discussion today are listed, where we're looking specifically for your guidance around the overall tone and structure of these substantive chapters, but also, with the specific strategies in mind, both sides of those questions in place. Does this draft chapter provide useful guidance for the city commission and staff to lead on racially equitable development? That's sort of the $1 million question of this entire project. Are we providing the guidance and strategy that's necessary to lead? What's missing or what's not quite right? Where should we bring in data and graphics as we sort of work toward a really great document that's a summary, but doesn't include everything. I also want to note that some of the early data from the 2020 census has started to be released, and there are different types of data products that we can bring in to support and ground some of this work. If there's anything that you see has already got momentum or that could have really quick momentum, what could potentially be a quick win, or what could we call out as something that's a first mover? How could you see this chapter in question influencing development and the development process? Where can the city lead, or where will the city play more of a support role? And what is the best way to hold the city accountable to implement, rather than, in the past, I think we've got lots of commentary about how the plan was not set up or structured in a way that was easy to be implemented. So the first chapter that we're going to get into is again, the Introduction in Gainesville Today section. Before we get into that, I just want to recognize that we also have staff on the line to support our discussion about those specific chapters once we get into the three chapters that are up for discussion today. And as Andrew mentioned, we'll get through the amount of content that we can get through sort of during the call this evening. We recognize that this is a lot of substantive discussion and meaningful content that we hope to get into. And if we aren't able sort of toward the latter part of the hold that we've got on our calendars right now, if we're lagging in our energy and we're not able to dedicate the time and focus and attention that we want to this discussion, we'll pause and we'll shift the remainder of the agenda to our next meeting. So overall, we're really excited to get into this content with you. This, is a challenging mandate that we've been given to provide a draft that sort of threads these different types of needles. And this is about solving this really big, complex issue of structural and systemic racism, and providing the guidance that the City Commission will need to lead on eliminating racial disparity. So there are new roles that the city sort of may be playing under a strategy like this, may not be leading on everything, might be supporting and playing a supportive role. There are uncomfortable conversations about historical, institutional, and current types of racism and how to combat that. And so that's our challenge. And we welcome all of your sort of feedback and commentary about where and how we can adjust what the drafts look like today. So this ends up being a really well-structured, comprehensive plan that gives us the grounding we need to move forward confidently and with an efficient use of government resources. So with that, sort of wanted to jump right into the introduction and Gainesville Today discussion. But I'll pause first in case there are any kind of overarching comments or questions before we dive in about our process or about what we're going to talk about while we're online.
Okay, it looks like Bob might have something. Go ahead.
I think on your second slide, and this is more the whole universe look at this, which is, center it on Black people and underserved minorities. And my question is, and how we deal with this, is that I think Black people in Gainesville represent about 20% of our population. How do we get the 80% on board with that concept? And because I think that's the real issue with this. The last time we did a really big comprehensive plan update was the form-based code, and we had dozens and dozens and dozens of meetings at all levels. And at the beginning, they were heavily attended by people who were very, very upset. And by the end, we transmitted it with almost nobody in attendance, meaning I took that to mean we had basically answered most of the questions that people had satisfactorily. And so that's my issue right this minute, is how we manage to center this on a minority population that is a very small minority, and get the buy-in we need to from the remaining large majority?
It's a really great and fundamental question, Bob. So thank you for bringing that up. And one of the ways that we've been talking about that so far is that and maybe this is about framing and how we talk about this strategy. I'll give an example where if you're doing planning, let's say for people living with disabilities, centering them and their improvements, let's say to curb cuts on the street, is an improvement for all. And so when we talk about centering Black people, it isn't to say we're creating a plan only for Black people. It's to say we're using this lens of looking at minority populations, those who have not benefited from the development process, to address issues that have been unaddressed for a long time. But by addressing those issues, we all benefit. And so there's a way of talking about this type of approach that I think we need to try to balance, or how we can talk about this with the wider public so we can create an understanding. But I think to your point around process and how we go about the process of community discussion, that's its own separate strategy as well. So I think it's both sides of that, of how do we lean into a different approach of using the expertise and leadership of people who are close to really urgent issues to create a solution that benefits everyone, and frame that in a way that doesn't result in opposition that
Right.
ultimately they will benefit from. And where's the way that we can open up these kinds of discussions, have a good process to get us to that really high quality discourse where people feel heard and people feel that we're responding to those comments. What we've done so far is to provide multiple ways that people can engage. Obviously, it's very difficult in a time of COVID to do engagement in the ways that maybe some of those community members are used to showing up. So we've tried lots of different things, and we are planning on creating a sort of a direct response to the commentary to say, this is how we heard you. This is where we are taking your direction. But I think it's a tricky thing to triangulate, and we'll welcome any of your sort of guidance or advice about how to have a conversation such as this with the public. It's a very new type of strategic planning framework, and it's leading to a very drastic departure from the current comprehensive plan.
And it strikes me, I mean, really the last several years, both the plan board and the city commission have rather routinely been accused of operating in secret, despite the fact that we're on TV. And so it strikes me that we're going to need to have a very broad opportunity for people in all kinds of situations to be made aware of this and request their input, and somehow get them to actually pay attention and provide that, which is what we're not getting right now. I have a friend of mine right now that there's a project apparently being built that Hillel owns some property that they're interested in developing, and my nephew's girlfriend has a house back there, and she said, oh yeah, I saw that sign there. I didn't know what it was about though. And it's kind of like, well, that's why the sign was there. You should have gone and read it. But I don't know how you get that step in a whole range of things to get people to actually engage.
Right.
But if they don't, they're going to say it's our fault.
Right. Yeah. So it's been a conversation ongoing throughout this project, in particular because we have to operate in such a remote kind of Zoom type fashion. There have been goods and bads to that. For instance, it's easier for people to dial in from their homes when it's a Zoom meeting rather than kind of going over physically. So there have been some people who, there have been wins and losses at the same time, but it's an important comment of how do we, continue to open up more space, especially now that these drafts are coming out, for people to really engage in a meaningful way. Any other sort of thoughts or comments before we dive into the introduction?
I just hope we don't have an artificially short ending to this. In other words, that we're under some kind of requirement to get this done at a set time when it may turn out that we need to extend it.
for this call today, we are planning, so we're planning several conversations with the plan board to get through all of this content. Whatever we don't get to in our conversation today will roll over to future agendas. So we did not want to artificially cut off the discussion here, and we'll have more time to come back in the future.
Yeah, I'm more interested in public discussion.
Oh, public discussion. Okay.
Yeah, public discussion,
Yes.
not ours.
Sure.
We can read all this crap and after a while we'll get up to speed.
Yeah.
Bob, we're not following the state's, EAR schedule. So it's on the city's
Okay.
own timeline.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done.
Christian?
Yeah, hello, everyone. I think I think this is really great and interesting and bold. And again, this is more of from a city and staff. Just given what everything, our country has sort of gone through the last sort of 2 years. And I can see some very organized, very negative opposition to this. I just hope that the city and everyone involved is ready for it, because, this is gonna, this is likely gonna, turn the apple cart in a lot of ways. It's gonna make a good group of a portion of our Gainesville community not very happy. So, we've got to sort of be ready, and because, and again, one of the things I was just in terms of I was thinking about some of the comments, and I hope this is not the case, but I could see a very organized sort of campaign where, we're going to get inundated with the same, basically, the same kind of comments, over and over and over and over. So, hopefully there's going to be a way of doing that, and also making sure that, all of the comments and everything that we sort of are getting we're actually getting from citizens of Gainesville and not outside entities. So.
Really, really great flags. And from our experience in engagement and survey processes to date, there are tactics and things that you can do to make sure that comments are coming from people who are connected to the city, that we're accommodating for duplicates. There's been a lot of progress over the last several years in helping cities to kind of manage a lot of these different types of tricky scenarios. And a lot of what we'll have to do is sort of create the opportunity for success and move forward, and use the city and city staff and leadership to lead and provide support where we can as consultants. We have been mandated by a resolution to create this type of document, and this is what we've produced. So there's a little bit about, start strong, and if we have to take anything backwards, we'll do that. But we want to start from a strong position of being direct and forthright with what we're talking about and specific. And if we need to negotiate that, we'll take that along the way.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think doing this in sort of a COVID time is really interesting, because I know you all have done some targeted outreach to reach specific people that maybe haven't engaged in the process before, but I don't know that there's been the same engagement of the people that we hear from a lot and that like to be engaged and show up at our meetings regularly. And so I don't want some of those active citizens and a majority of, the population of Gainesville to feel like they're hearing about this at the 11th hour.
Right.
And so I know that you've been targeting certain populations, but the whole city needs to understand what's going on before it becomes official.
And I think part of it is how we frame the engagement to date. Absolutely, we've been targeting our outreach, or some of our outreach, to those who we haven't heard from, because we know if we don't do that, we won't hear from them. We've also opened up opportunities for anyone to join. So if anyone is, dialing into plan board meetings, to city commission meetings, if they're looking for an opportunity to engage with the comprehensive plan, we've been using the city's sort of some of the overall email lists And, we have created opportunities for, let's say, for instance, if someone wanted to bring this conversation about the comp plan to their neighborhood association, to their district, that they're able to do that. So we've been trying to serve both audiences of those who have not been engaged in planning so far and those who have, but it's been, under a time of COVID. And so there are always, limitations to that. And as we move forward, the more that we can continue emphasizing all channels, if you want to be involved in this, we want your feedback. We want your input. This is what we're going to do with it. Please participate in the process. We win if we're all involved. That, we can take that in and move with it rather than it being a criticism at the approval hearing, creating that kind of environment.
And I would just add, I think in addition to some of the targeted outreach, we've also pushed a lot out on social media, on the city's social media, which a lot of the kind of, folks that typically engage, those are a lot of the mediums that they're looking at. And we've talked a lot with the city commission about making sure that they're talking to their, most active constituents about this. And so the idea is hopefully we're not going to show up at the altar, and have a bunch of folks who are, nobody talked to me. Although of course that always happens regardless of how well you do engagement. But yeah, I think we're in addition to some of the targeted stuff, we've also been pushing out on more of the traditional channels.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Bob and I just have this concern, especially because we went through the form-based code where there were probably 100 meetings easily before adoption. And so I know some of that has been happening, but if I don't know about it as someone who gets city emails and am on the plan board, how does my neighbor in my neighborhood know about it if I don't know that this has been happening, so I just wonder about the average citizen not knowing that this is going on. So, and I understand it's been a challenging time, but I mean, the form-based code was quite something. The public engagement was quite something. And so I want to be sure that we're giving this sort of an equivalent opportunity for the public to engage.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd add to that, I mean, having been there with you guys during that time, I do think that at a basic level, there is a challenge independent of COVID or any other restrictions that we've been operating in with the last year. I think there's just an inherent challenge with getting people excited about what is essentially an abstract, expression of legislative intent, which is the comprehensive plan. Unlike a code where you're like, hey, neighbor, I'm rezoning your property from A to B. That is the most direct way to get people to engage, as opposed to, hey, neighbor, I'm doing this decades long plan where I want your feedback on an abstract concept for some input that may at some point have some bearing on some downstream decision, even though we all having been engaged and understand the comprehensive planning, know that this is in some ways a very, very almost the most critical time for setting long-term policy, as well as any subsequent land development regulations. Is really hard to get people really excited and jazzed about this kind of stuff, independent of any other restrictions. I think like Lydia said, we've been trying to do a lot more kind of different types of outreach, hoping to get more both understanding from those people who are really trying to get their voices in this plan. But at the end of the day, it still is a challenge, just because for a lot of people in the community, they don't see a direct causal benefit from participating in this process and to their day-to-day struggles, and experiences in life. And that is the real difficulty, I think, in trying to tie this policy concept to their basic sort of day-to-day experience.
Any other overarching questions, comments before we go on?
I don't see any other hands. Anybody else want to jump in?
Okay. Well, we've got a full agenda, so let's go ahead and go into, again, first the Introduction in Gainesville Today chapter. And as we sort of go through this discussion, just to recall some of the questions to keep in mind, at the end of the day, we're looking for this document to provide useful guidance for the City Commission and staff to read on equitable, racially equitable development of the city. So is this providing that kind of guidance, the framework and foundation to help steer us in that direction? What's missing? What's not quite right? Where should we consider bringing in data or different kinds of graphics? These kinds of questions, hold in your minds as we go through this discussion. I'm going to do a brief kind of screen share and orienting us to the content, but really not do a lot of work to go into the bullet by bullet of what's in here. Just kind of, ground us a little bit about what we're talking about here. And I'll take the screen share down and ask for any of your kind of initial thoughts and reactions when you first read these chapters. What were your reactions? And we'll kind of take it from there. I'm happy to pull back up the screen share and look at specific sections as needed. Okay. So on this first page here is Meet Erica. Throughout this process, one of the ways that we tried to, as Andrew was talking about, connect the comprehensive plan to the everyday life experience is by using a specific character. Erica is a 36-year-old Black mother of two, born and raised in Gainesville, where she and her family live today. And by introducing this character, we talk about, her lifestyle and the ways that the comprehensive plan in the past, the ways that our development patterns have progressed in the past, have led to a situation that create a series of overlapping difficulties that lessen our overall economic productivity, that limit our economic growth and prosperity, and really make it difficult specifically for her to lead a good life in the city. So we bring up a couple of examples about the connectivity between, safe housing and the housing that she can't find and afford, transportation and the difficulties of her navigating the transportation system, how it's difficult for her to move forward in her life because of the failures or different pieces of breakdown within the transportation system or community resources like childcare, and things about how she, as we have been talking about today, she is disconnected from the real estate development process. And so as her neighborhood changes, she isn't really able to be connected and be involved. So we have introduced this character throughout our public conversations and in the interactive kind of online interactivity that we've facilitated throughout this process. And we're planning to bring in a character like this throughout the document to make note of, well, this is how it affects your everyday life. This is how a section like this would potentially make your quality of life better. And, this is one of the ways that we're sort of centering Black Gainesville residents, but an improvement to the transportation system not only helps her, but helps everyone. So this page is about Erica, and the following pages are about the overall introduction to the plan and our summary of Gainesville today, where, again, I'm not going to go through all of the detail about what's in here. I'm just going to kind of signpost a little bit of the sections. So here we talk about how, Gainesville has been the center for business education, et cetera, for more, but not everyone has benefited in the same way. And we go into some of the specifics about that disparity, how that's linked to different types of discrimination and investment, and different types of choices that were made around development have created a lasting legacy. We go on to talk about some of the recent efforts that the city has done to specifically address these types of issues and the mandate and resolution for this plan. We go from there into what is a comp plan and what is Imagine GNV? What is a comprehensive plan have the power to do? It's a legally binding document that guides these types of decisions on which types of issues. We bring into the framework some of the things that we've already been talking about on this call, how we shape this process, these pillars of design guidelines that have shaped our process so far, a little bit about the power that the city actually has to influence, the development patterns and processes and trends in our community, so rules and protections, spending and investment and public participation. These are three formats of power that the city can wield to make progress on different issues with the support of the comprehensive plan. We talk here about who shaped this plan and the different types of engagement processes that we have undertaken to support this plan. We articulate some of the questions that were asked in those different types of meetings and some of the initial outputs, which will be updated upon, when we get more toward a final draft, some of the outputs of what we heard back. And then lastly, in the introduction, we talk about how to use this plan, how this plan is intended to be used. So just an overall introduction to the different types of chapters and, of this chapter of accountability and the idea of the technical appendices, sort of explaining some of the outline elements of the different document items. After that introduction, we've got a couple of specific call outs where in the final document, this might be presented as a layout, kind of multiple pages, its own section where we can kind of determine where it best fits within the narrative. And one of them is specifically on this discussion we've been having today, why focus on racial equity? So providing some definitions about inequity, about how racism has provided a platform for success and quality of life for some, but not for others. That when some people are marginalized, our entire economy suffers. And what does that mean? We would be stronger economically and benefit from the greater inclusion of those people who have been marginalized. That inclusion not only benefits the economy, but our political and community life. If people are living better lives, then we all benefit in multiple ways. That addressing systemic racism improves our collective future, and that to take action and create that shared prosperity that we want in our future, we must first look at the root causes of low quality of life and marginalization across Gainesville today. So this is an important sort of framing section that introduces and connects a lot of these concepts about why a framework like this can lead to the benefit of everyone. So that's the introduction. We move from then into the section about Gainesville today. About, in our kind of current existing conditions, existing landscape, this is all about sort of how do we understand the current challenges and sort of projected challenges that Gainesville faces that are to be addressed in a comprehensive plan document. So we talk first about, how did we get here? That, we today enjoy a wonderful natural environment, strong community values, this sort of great place that people love to enjoy and move to and stay in for generations. But over time, our recorded history has both dramatically changed, and we can see how we have created sort of systems of disparity that led to the inequity that we see. So there's a little bit of history lesson for those who are less familiar with the history of development in Gainesville, and things like how redlining have contributed to lower valuation of certain neighborhoods, sort of bringing into context some of that history about how our country overall and Gainesville has specifically developed that led to the inequity that we see. So going into that a little bit, there's a section I'll get into at the end that goes more detail. After that, how did we get here? We go into a where we are today section where we talk about inequity in 21st century Gainesville. So this is a little bit of the big problem. If this comp plan is meant to address the big problems or build on our strengths for the next 10 years, then what are our strengths and what are the challenges that we're meant to address? So in terms of strengths, Gainesville enjoys a rich cultural history in a natural environment. Gainesville is a growing community and an economy. Gainesville's youth and diversity has led to the continued investment in quality of life throughout the city. And there are pockets of naturally affordable housing that exists in some areas across the city, and that's not something to be overlooked. It's not something that every city benefits from. In terms of the quick summary of the challenges, quality of life includes these types of stark disparities by race that we've been talking about. The demand for housing is driving up rents and spurring development that prompts fears of displacement within historic communities of color. And Gainesville faces an increasing risk of flood and heat crises. So even just a couple of weeks ago, we were seeing sort of notices of, be aware of the heat and the heat danger. thinking about, issues of recurring sort of flooding and the spill off effects of as our coastal communities sort of flood more often, what that does to the growth and development of Gainesville as a more, position within North Central Florida. So thinking about all of these challenges and all of these strengths, how do we sort of plan for our next decade? And the last element that's included in the current version of this Introduction in Gainesville Today section is a short history of Gainesville, where it goes just into a little bit more detail. The one above is just a little bit more abbreviated. We went into this kind of exploration of historical concepts, but took it out from the main body of the plan. Not sure about to what extent we should bring in this level of historical context into the final document, but we go into the early history of the city, how the land was originally sort of overseen and tended to by Native American peoples, how colonization and the processes of colonization from the Spanish, the British, and Americans has sort of really changed the nature of who lives here, how the land is developed, what the economy looks like. We talk about the Seminole peoples and their sort of removal through the Seminole Trail of Tears, as well as sort of freedmen and the experience of Black people sort of before and after slavery. So we go into a little bit of that. It's obviously you have to make choices when you're going through some of the history. So some of it has been abbreviated, but it's much more historical context that is included in the current comp plan. We talk about the founding of modern Gainesville and the continued tension that existed between different communities in Gainesville as we moved through the 1800s into the 1900s. We talk then about economic expansion and the inequitable economic development that happened in the 1900s. We bring up things like the GI Bill, the Great Depression, UF and the kind of relationship between the GI Bill and UF and sort of large influxes of veterans and other students. We talked about restrictive racial covenants and different items that were put into place to spur development in some areas, but not others, and continued investments in things like the city airport, public utilities, and streets that sort of happened in some areas and not others. Talk a little bit about annexation, which is a big sort of influencing factor of how Gainesville has developed and changed over time, and conserve land. And we end with the fact that while there has been an increased mixing of populations over time, there are still these stark geographical disparities and segregation today. So again, those sort of latter two sections are call outs where we go into more history of Gainesville, and we've got some framing about why racial equity, but that is the content that's currently included in this sort of upfront section of the comp plan. So I'll take down my screen share, but I'm happy to bring it back up and go through any specific elements, but opening up for overarching comments and reactions. What did you all sort of think about when you sort of saw this type of introduction to this type of comprehensive plan? What's missing, what's not quite right? And ultimately, does this give the city leadership and staff a direction and a framework and a foundation for leading on development that is grounded in racial equity?
Thomas, I think you have your hand up. You want to kick things off?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I like the direction with this. I think the City Commission was really bold, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out. And I think reading this introduction does what you described wanting to do, centering it and getting context. And I have a question about nomenclature. And so this is not necessarily to the substance of the introduction as it relates to racial equity. So the statutes describe comp plans breaking their language down in goals, objectives, and policies. I don't think they mandate that we use those terms. And so I like that you've come up with a new set of nomenclature for describing how the plan language is organized. And I especially like the inclusion of indicators. I think that when I talk to incoming planners or people who are just learning about planning, the concept of writing language that's measurable is not intuitive. And by calling these things indicators, I think we take a big step towards helping to write language that's measurable. I do think we lose something by eschewing the word policy, though. One thing that this plan is going to need to do when we get to the end is include substantive language for city issuing permits, right? We use this when we make budgeting decisions, and the city uses this, you know, to feel good about itself or to establish its direction outward facing when members of the public read it. But we also use this document to decide whether or not to issue permits. And none of those three words, outcomes, strategies, or indicators, really lend themselves towards drafting directions. An application must meet the standard in order for the city to approve it, right? We can't vacate a street unless the proposal meets these criteria. The city's not going to approve a gas station unless the fueling positions are arranged this way. And so so I do think one is kind of a broader question. I do hope we're intending to include substantive policies going forward that are in the current plan. But two, that we add a fourth word to this description of how the plan is organized, and the word being policy. And that when we do have directions, we call them policies because that's the most clear and direct language to say what those things are. Does that make sense? Is that something that y'all agree with, or am I kind of missing that it fits within the framework you've outlined?
No, I think it makes sense. Just to react quickly, but I welcome in sort of thoughts and reactions from Ari or Andrew or anybody else on the line. I think one of the things that, you know, as we see this come together, that's the type of observation that we're hoping to sort of make. And, you know, if this was stemming from our templates of, we need to be clear about what is our ultimate and desired outcome. And then what are the strategies that we're using to get there? And then how are we measuring success? I would position policy and the direction that we take as a specific measure of behavior or guidance or rules as one of the strategies. And so I think we're thinking about how to include or what level that those types of guidance are going to be included. We've got some of that information that currently lives in our technical appendices because it's very specific around things like level of service, as I sort of mentioned earlier. So I think it's a good question. I don't have a perfect response to you right now about where exactly those will sit, but we do think that that's very important for us to be very clear about where to look when you're making different types of decisions.
Let me ask a question about the technical appendices then. When you described them, I was kind of thinking like a ladder. Like if you're interested in, you know, this thing that you used to find in the future land use element, now it's in this other element under this section.
That's exactly what we're thinking of.
So those appendices aren't necessarily going to include substantive directions for applicants or staff or the city commission or the plan board when it's considering applications.
They could include a variety of things. And right now, I think two responses to your question. We're planning on including a document that's exactly like what you were talking about, where if you're looking for something specific, this is where you find it. I think that's one of the things that'll be important just to orient anybody to, you know, this is a new structure of document. So that's a structural organizational piece that we're definitely going to include. This is where you find different pieces. But there are different types of appendix items where some of that, I think we're intending for the chapters themselves to include the body of the direction and the strategic guidance overall vision. But some of those technical appendices will be things like specific guidelines for how things will be implemented. It could also be specific types of compliance regulations. So we're looking at the current comprehensive plan and some of those elements that we want to preserve as items of specific reference or guidance. Some of those do belong in our current chapters. Some of those will slide up and they'll be included in the substance of the strategies themselves. Some of those will stay in the comp plan, but just in another form. So we'll have different types of technical appendices to include different items, and others will be excluded.
Here, so I have a couple of specific suggestions based on what you just said. So the first one is, I think that if something is substantive direction, it will not be intuitive for somebody who is not in the business of land development regulation to look at an appendice for those instructions. So we should strive to include those in the chapters or elements, whatever we want to call them. The second is your suggestion of having, you know, what we might have considered to be policies, as I described them a minute ago, into the strategies. that sounds fine, right? We don't need to have like a separate name for them to include that kind of language in there. But a third comment would be, I didn't read every word of the chapters that you proposed, but when I spent time with them over the weekend, I was looking for areas where we had specific direction.
Yep.
It would be this kind of question, based on this word, if I'm reviewing a special exception application, rezoning, a variance, a generic development permit, what characteristics can I look for in that application to identify whether this meets the standard in the plan? And I think the current language is difficult to accomplish that end.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily a criticism, because I think the kinds of ideas that are in the current drafts are still at this headier general aspirational level, but we
Yep.
do need to drill down to those substantive policies. So I guess my suggestion would be, sort of like, bone up on how to author that language in a way that the city's not going to issue the permit unless it meets these standards. Here's the standards. The road must be 20 feet wide, or the building must be mixed use, whatever those standards are. So that's good. I appreciate everything you said. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's super good feedback. I was just going to say, way before, even before we had the resolution I mentioned, like I had called Department of Economic Opportunity, and I had a conversation with a couple of their folks, including our reviewer. And I said, look, we're kind of talking in the city about doing this comp plan update, and we're kind of interested in maybe getting away from the strict kind of 9J5 format that we've used. And like, what do you think about the idea of like doing things sort of thematically, and like, and organizing things maybe a little bit differently than maybe just, the strict, like, this element, this element, this element. And so they nodded and they said, well, yeah, I think that could be it, right? But you're still going to have the elements, right? And I'm like, yeah, we'll have the elements. And I could tell it was like, you're at the bank teller and they're pushing the emergency silent alarm underneath the table during that conversation. But I think, like we've talked about, we've had a couple of subsequent meetings with them, and we've talked about like having some nomenclature, I think, in the actual plan, which will still have reference to the statutory required elements, just called out a little bit differently. But I think to the substantive, and the sort of like the functional kind of workaday part of the comp plan, I think the substantive, strategies that deal like with like some of what's sort of been discussed, like gas station design, some of those things. Those, I think, either as Lydia said, will make it up into the body, or will be pulled out and put into the like how we build chapter that we talked about. But the substantive parts that that this board still uses on a like for determining permit compliance will still be present. We're just that's part of what we're still kind of working out right now, thinking through.
Okay, Bob, you got hand up.
Thank you. I do. Explain to me, since I seem to have lost the connection, of why much of what we're talking about is not specified in the land development code.
I think that is I think a valid question. I would say, the some of what was in the comp plan has now been moved to the land development code. But I think it's always been this sort of, push and pull a little bit at the city about which areas or how much technical kind of standards should be in the comp plan versus the land development code. Yeah, but I mean, you take your point.
My understanding is we don't actually have to have a land development code. We could just operate with a comp plan. I understand it's a radical concept, but I understand that it's at least theoretically possible. Have we even considered it? Because quite frankly, for people who are not development lawyers like Thomas, I'm just kidding, Thomas. The distinction between the comp plan and the land development code is baffling to people who do not operate in this environment all the time.
Sure.
And so I'm throwing out a radical concept.
Yeah, admittedly, I haven't thought about that. I don't know if anyone's seen examples of that either, here in Florida or Lydia. Have you guys seen any, or Ari, seen any of that in your practice?
We haven't. This is I guess to start first, around the country, comprehensive plans are seen as toothless documents that really don't have any implementing power. And they include a lot of mandated information that must be updated at a certain frequency. But beyond that, you don't really reference them for much. And so I think there are lots of reasons why comp plans have, fallen out of favor or are not useful. And part of that is process, part of that's regulation. What we've tried to do is to help this be, if someone is leading the city, like the city commission is looking for an overall direction around how does the city grow and change, that they have a place to reference that feels like it's doing more than just providing the mandated information. I don't think that we've looked into your specific question around could we do away with the land development code to actually combine the two. It has come up a lot that how do we differentiate between these two documents? It's been a question that's come up multiple times. I think one of the things that we're planning so far is to include specific language in the comp plan around how the code should be updated to align with the comp plan or to accommodate for certain factors. There's also a lot of more detailed and granular planning around, parcel maps and zoning and the future land use map that isn't really a part of this process, but is part of a continuing process to update the granularity of detail that people, will provide more neighborhood feedback on because it directly relates to them. But I think it's an interesting concept. It's just, I think around the country, I haven't seen that as a precedent. I think people will invest time in the code and they deprioritize the vision piece because they can get away with it. So we can bookmark that and continue looking into that as something to consider or to lift up as an opportunity.
Yeah, I know, Thomas, you have your hand up, but I'm just going to jump in. There are a number of places that the code and the comp plan are inconsistent currently. And so I think, as somebody who works in this space in my professional life, I think reducing the number of places that we're essentially giving criteria twice and have the opportunity for inconsistencies should be reduced. I do think that both the code and the comp plan have a purpose. And so in places where they're both trying to do the same thing, we should pick one or the other. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that trying to eliminate the code is going to be helpful, because I think then your appendices just get to be a land development code, right?
Yep.
But I do think we need to look at the places where there are inconsistencies. Some of that has come in, some of it is, even getting a special use permit and how you get additional density. The code says one thing, you can do it by saving a tree. The comp plan says you get a special use permit through the plan board. Well, we follow the comp plan policy. The code really should be updated. And so I think as a part of this process, and, I hope, maybe we're keeping track of those inconsistencies as we find them, and we're going to see a concurrent code update. And maybe some of that is moving things, to one document or the other, so they aren't in both anymore.
Yeah, and just to quickly respond along what's happening along those lines, it's exactly that process where if we're finding things that we're saying internally that belong more in the code, that we're noting that, setting it aside, and then specifically mentioning that there is a land development code update that's needed. And these are some of the elements that would be included in an update process. It won't be concurrent to the release of this, but it sort of is triggered by some of the kind of implementing language that's included in the comp plan. Sorry, Bob, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Great.
Well,
Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to volunteer one little piece to that, which is as long as we have separate documents, LDC and comp plan documents, they inevitably begin to diverge. One gets changed, the other one doesn't catch up, which means we're constantly in this update feature where somebody has to fix these in a big overhaul. And it strikes me, we ought to at least consider, I think Thomas's or Stephanie had the right idea that where we're saying the same thing, we need to get it out of one or the other documents.
Thomas?
That's it. I'm sorry, Thomas.
I had a bunch of thoughts in response to Bob's comment. One is, of all the cities of which I'm aware, or counties of which I'm aware in Florida, the one that comes the closest to what she described that I'm familiar with is Cedar Key, which has no zoning map. They rely on their future land use map for all the regulatory authority of, it's the only map that says where things go in the city. But I don't know of anybody that doesn't have a land development code entirely. But I had 3 more specific thoughts. One, I absolutely agree with both you and Stephanie that if we can pinpoint a single place to have a rule, that's preferable to having it repeated in multiple places, because it's exactly the reason you gave, the likelihood of conflict. 2, it used to be easier to have things in your land development code because state law limited the city to updating its comp plan to twice a year, and going through the objection recommendations and comment process at DCA was a bear. That's no longer true. DEO just kind of takes your paperwork and says, sure. They are absolutely not in the practice of checking comp plans for compliance, even when state law suggests that they should. So then that comes to a third point I have, which is under the state of Florida law, absolutely the best place for the city to put rules is in the comp plan. And the big picture reason is because lots of tools exist under state law to fight with cities over their what they put in their land development code. Relatively few tools exist over whether to put what they put in their comp plan. So the city's in a stronger posture vis-a-vis anybody who sort of disagrees with the policy by putting it in the comp plan. But at the same time, state law has the consistency challenge where if ultimate development decisions aren't done with the comp plan, anybody, whether it's a developer or a resident, can challenge consistency. And so you simultaneously have put the city in this posture, one, of having broad legislative authority to make decisions only limited by the Growth Management Act, but 2, vis-a-vis the public and the property owners having to maintain fidelity to those decisions once they're made. And so that's my 2 cents. I think that might be a question we would ask the city attorney, but I think clearly based on those 2 factors, that if we're gonna, we obviously should, I don't think we should only have one document, put everything in the comp plan, but if we're kind of debating where something should go, comp plan's the best place for it, because of that sort of unique relationship that it has under Florida law.
I want to also point out in this discussion that I think one of the things that we'd like to move forward with as a recommendation is to have a greater connection. You know, Bob, you're talking about how one moves forward and then the other is old and it has to always be updating. What can we do to simplify and streamline city decision-making? There's also the, recurring updates to the city's strategic plan and the annual updates to the budget. There are lots of these different, ongoing conversations that are constant. And the fact that there are multiple of them, how difficult is it then for the public to track what's going on and to figure out where do I put my 2 cents in? Is it on the budget? Is it on the strategic plan? Is it on the code where it's closest to my neighborhood? And so the more that we can connect these processes and to bring them more into, well, if one's updated, then it automatically results in an update elsewhere, or how do we keep them in line? That's a conversation we want to have, with sort of city management and leadership and our teams on inside sustainable development, of how can we better connect these? Because as of now, being disconnected creates a lot of dysfunction and things get out of date rather than staying current over time. I want to bring us to, before we move on to other substantive chapters, with this introduction, anything else that we all would react to? We've got a lot of substantive framing in here around, why focus on racial equity, how we're describing the current situation we find ourselves in, the challenges that we must address. Is there anything that we want to sort of discuss about the substance of this specific language before we move on to other chapters?
Not yet.
I just wanted to say that I think simply having like a narrative introduction to the plan is a really big thing. Like in terms of like trying to describe to like kind of what we were talking about, like linking this plan to like why people should care about it in the community, like having like a narrative introduction is like, that's a big step forward for the city. Right now you open it up and it might be the future land use element or maybe another element, whatever you however you put your binder together, but there's really kind of no expression of like, what is this plan, what is it trying to do, why should you care about it, how does it work? So I think that's I don't want to like move on without recognizing that as well.
Okay, it looks like, is Brittany signed in as the
Yes.
admin? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say maybe let's check with the public call-in line before we move on.
Okay. Do we have anyone on the call-in line right now?
We do not. There's nobody on the line at this time. Excuse me.
Perfect.
Thanks for checking in.
Any other comments on introduction in Gainesville today before we move forward? If not, I will pass the baton over to my colleague Ari to introduce our how we get around transportation and mobility section.
Can you all hear me okay? Right.
Yes.
Thank you, Lydia. I'll first go through the how we get around chapter, and I'll share my screen to just walk you through the highlights, and we'll open it up for your comments and questions. Can you all see the PDF that shows the plan language?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So we're excited to share this chapter with you. You'll see that this chapter and the two others that we'll walk through with you today are structured a little bit differently from the introduction chapter that Lydia mentioned. It'll more be along the lines of, initial framing specific for this chapter about the importance of transportation mobility and the ability for all of us to get around. And then we'll dive into three big outcomes, and then under which there will be the indicators that Thomas mentioned earlier, as well as the strategic actions that the city will take. So you'll see this in motion as I walk through. So starting with the where we are and how we got here, we have a short section that talks about why transportation and mobility is important in Gainesville, and of course, to bring it home to the point of racial equity, starting to think about, how does racial inequity exist and manifest in the context of transportation and mobility? And of course, this is something that we heard from you during our last session together, as well as through many comments submitted through the survey and listening sessions. So we really wanted to get into how, depending on who you are and where you live, does your ability to get around in Gainesville is different. So for example, bus frequencies are different. Some people have ample sidewalks and bike lanes. Others don't have that many options to get around, but still have longer commutes. So a section that ties into that and starting to draw the lines between historic patterns of course, racially motivated land use decisions and racial covenants and redlining, as well as the history of how the city has developed. And of course, this is a very high level overview that's meant to complement some of the introductory, more deeper dive section that Lydia talked through, but bringing this to this chapter specifically to set the stage in the context of transferability. Further down in the introduction section, we have a section called Progress to Build On. So really highlighting the city's efforts to date, including the last mile, first mile, transit services, and the things that the city is already taking action to move forward in terms of racial equity in Gainesville. And then a last section about what's at stake. So really hammering home the idea of what it could look like if all Gainesvillians had access to equitable transit and mobility services. So this is the upfront introduction section, and I'll talk us through a very high level overview of each of the 3 outcomes that we have lined up for this chapter. So the outcomes are really meant to be as Lydia mentioned, the North Star for where the city should be and wants to be in 10 years. The first outcome talks through how all Gainesville residents, regardless of their identity, will have access to equitable, reliable, affordable, and safe transportation. We have a set of indicators under each outcome like this that are going to be the measurable targets and how the city can track progress and keep itself accountable. Under this, we have a set of strategies that will all support in different ways to move forward on this outcome. So things like continuing to provide a fair free transit for residents who rely on public transit, things like developing a mobility equity plan, and all of these items that will provide big shifts and continued action on the city's part to make sure that the city's moving forward. And you'll see that under each strategy, there's a short section on providing the context for why this specific strategy is called for and what related actions that the city is already taking under this strategy. So I'll skip over some of the strategies to move us forward into outcome 2. So here we have a separate outcome that talks specifically about the city and all Gainesvillians having what they need to be less reliant on cars and living in neighborhoods with quality pedestrian and bike infrastructure, and then therefore contributing to a more sustainable city. And so similar to the last outcome, we have a set of indicators that talk specifically about sidewalks, having low-speed streets, bicycle facilities, trail networks, and all of these indicators. Again, trying to disaggregate as much as possible by race and ethnicity as well as neighborhoods, so that we're not just tracking progress at the city level as a whole, but looking into how will progress look like for different groups of people and being able to track that too. Similarly, we have a set of strategies that talk through this specific outcome. So things like prioritizing funding for walking, cycling related investments, especially in low-income communities where people may be more reliant on public transit and walking and cycling, as well as in communities of color who have not seen the level of investment that other neighborhoods have seen today. Moving us forward into outcome 3, this is an outcome that is intended to build on the city's work on the Vision Zero framework, understanding that this needs a prominent highlight in the comp plan. So this outcome specifically talks through having no traffic-related deaths or severe injuries. Similarly, we have indicators that make sure the city is able to track crash rates and crash severity rates by neighborhood. And we have a few specific strategies, all of them pertaining to advancing the Vision Zero action strategy to make sure that we're building the bridges and making sure, to Lydia's earlier point about keeping things consistent and using this as an opportunity to boost some of the efforts that the city is already moving forward on. So that was a very a quick overview, and I wanted to give a shout out to Juan, who's on the line today, who's been tremendously helpful in leading this work, as well as Debbie Leitner, as well as everybody at RTS who were able to pitch in and review this draft and make sure that what we're building here is consistent with their work. And so thank you to all of you, and I'll stop sharing for a minute and open up to questions.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on this one? Thomas, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think I know the answer from the conversation on the introduction. We've got lots of substantive policies in the transportation element on the TMPA, et cetera. Are you proposing now to delete any of those, or we're going to be looking at them later in our technical appendices?
I can take that. We're not proposing to delete any of that. A lot of that will go into the appendices. Some of the language within the comp plan or the proposed comp plan now talks about potentially changing or mitigating the TMPA zone to better reflect a more equitable distribution of funds in order to create a more equitable or be able to support more equitable transportation services. But as far as deleting the TMPA, no, that's not one of the proposals. Okay.
And I just use TMPA as an example. Are we proposing deleting any of the self-executing policies that are in the element? And I know we might, I don't want to like make everybody promise that we're not going to ever. I just want to know, like, are we as part of this conversation, if I don't see a certain policy reiterated here, should I assume it's because we're deleting it, or should I assume it's because we're going to talk about it later in the technical appendices?
I think that would be more appropriate to talk about later. There are certain requirements that we're required to show in our comp plan as far as appendices as well, that we'll be including in the appendices. We're not doing any of the
okay. When we get around to looking at those, if we are proposing substantially rewriting them so they might mean something different or deleting them, if we could get strike through underline version, and I know that's not always possible. Sometimes we just need to say we're striking this objective and replacing it with this language, or we're striking it all together. But to the extent that it's practical to present in strike through underline language, that would be really helpful. And thanks. I like the policy direction in this that this represents. So thank you, staff, and Erie and Lydia.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, anybody else with comments on this one? Okay, not seeing any board members. Is there anyone on the phone line?
No, ma'am, there's nobody on the lines at this time.
Okay.
Okay. And just a couple of other questions before we move on. You know, there are places where we'd like to bring data and graphics in to kind of, you know, go through some of, let's say, specific areas of disparity that we'd like to drill into, and bringing some of this into greater context. So that might be another hole that we fill as we go through, you know, continue to go through the drafting process. We're also doing some work to identify what we're calling quick wins, which are sort of like either this is already underway or there's some existing momentum within the city. There's existing pot of funding that's available to move this forward. So things like Vision Zero, that's an opportunity for us to, as we work on the implementation strategy for this kind of policy direction, kind of identifying where that is and positioning that as we're already moving forward in this direction. And these are how our existing efforts are supporting these broader goals. That's another thing that you'll sort of, you know, hopefully see in the DNA of some of the strategies that are in the current chapters. Andrew, did you have something to add in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe highlight or emphasize what you said. I think one of the exercises that we've been doing internally as staff, and I would be interested in, you know, and maybe this being something that the plan board thinks about as well as you're reviewing these, is, you know, the city is going to have two like major tranches of federal funding through the American Rescue Plan. And we've talked about, there's a sort of whole list of sort of high level topics or areas that the city commission has sort of, you know, started discussing about ways to use that money here locally. There's a lot of overlap between a lot of what we're talking about with and ideas that are here in this plan with what the commission's talked about. So some of the things that we've been discussing is like pulling out some of the quick wins or the kind of ideas that may have a funding implication, and seeing if there's we could tie those to some of the commission's ideas around some of the ARP funding. because, this is, a much more expansive comprehensive plan than what we have currently in terms of topic areas. I think there's like a lot of connection between the ARP funds and some of the ideas that we've included in the plan. So if the plan board sees any of that, or if you in doing so, you think like this should be something that we should prioritize in terms of potential funding, then that would be good feedback as well. We've started to do that as staff, but the more eyes, the better.
Right. And I guess my add-on to that is that, just like we're talking about the code as one of the implementing mechanisms, things like city funding, if this is providing a policy vision, there are other ways for us to move these forward, and the code is one, but we're also opening this up to include some of those other implementing tools where we can improve our processes without changing the code. It just requires us to do something differently. We can fund greater engagement, more public outreach, changes to our other policies, and that's all sort of separate from the code. So just wanted to bring in that there are multiple ways that this type of document can move forward, and directly allocating funding with these visionary strategies as the North Star is another way that they can advance outside of the code.
Great.
So with that, I think we can move on to the next one. And I think, we're happy to keep whipping through this, and I'm sure that we'll get more commentary and discussion from all of you as we sort of see the whole plan come together. But Mary, why don't we flip to the next chapter discussion?
Sounds good. I'll share my screen again. And I did scroll through pretty quickly last time, so please feel free to chime in and stop me at any point if you'd like to do a deeper read through as I'm talking through. So our next chapter is the How We Learn, and we're really excited for multiple reasons for this chapter, understanding that this used to be a public school element, but now through the work of Nate and the dads who are on the call here today, we've really taken to expand how we think about education overall. So of course, public education and strong partnerships with the school board is critical, but also thinking through things that the city can do within its powers to make sure that all Gatesvillians have an opportunity for continued education, regardless of their background. So excited to see this chapter come together. So similar to the How We Get Around chapter, we have a section that talks about where we are and how we got here today, underscoring the importance of education, both for the city as it stands now, but for future generations shaping the future of the city moving forward. We have a section talking through existing disparities in terms of school performance and trying to tie that into, well, what did historic actions tell us about how the city is today, and how some families have all of the resources that they need for their children's education and development, while some do not have that opportunity or resources. And then moving us to highlight some of the progress that the city can build on, including its partnership with the school board, as well as other organizations and institutions that are active in this space today. And then a section about what's at stake, again, underscoring the importance of addressing racial equities in the context of education. And so we have also 3 outcomes for this chapter. The first outcome is specific to public education, and there's many mentions of strong partnerships with the school board, but the outcome is all Gainesville residents will have access to a quality public education, and all schools will benefit the surrounding community. Similar to our mobility chapter, we have a few indicators that talk through school capacity, school performance, as well as how public school sites can support surrounding communities and have the facilities that neighbors need that could be housed on a school board site. Thinking about commute times and how children get to school and what that means in terms of reducing racial inequity. And then thinking about things like affordable housing that all support children's learning and development. So So these are some of the indicators, and then moving on to strategies that support this outcome. We of course have a robust section on coordinating with the school board of Villaggio County, and we're really happy to see a representative here on this call today. We've highlighted some actions that the city can take within its powers to make sure that coordination is tight between the city and the school board. We also touch upon things like addressing land use to make sure that things like childcare and job training can be housed on school sites. Again, we touch on transportation options to school and after school activities, working with the Department of Sustainable Development to make sure that the city is addressing things like affordable housing, near high school performing schools, and then utilizing school sites to contribute to the needs of families and the surrounding neighborhood as a whole. And then things like after school care for students as well. Moving forward to outcome two, which is more specific to increase transparency into decision-making processes regarding schools. So things like making sure that data around school performance and capacity and all of those things are available and accessible to people, as well as making sure that the city is getting input from a diverse group of neighbors and parents and students and educators when it comes to things like schools or things that are very tied, topics that are very much tied to education. We have strategy, which is something that we presented to the City Commission a few months back about establishing a neighbors education center and having a dedicated city staff member to really drive this forward. This can do things like making sure that neighbors have a place to go when they are seeking access to educational resources, certification, training, and being really the liaison with other educational institutions in Gainesville who are in the city and coordinating with public stakeholders such as the school board on behalf of the city. And then to my earlier point, creating a data hub that really takes in all the information and data that are collected both at the city level and from partners such as the school board, and making it accessible to folks and increasing the transparency that neighbors have in terms of how decisions are made regarding schools. We have strategies that talk specifically about conducting outreach and making sure that when decisions regarding schools are made, it's made in places that are accessible in locations, as well as times, and things like ADA compliance, and making sure that people are incentivized to participate, so that people who typically may not have the resources to prioritize attending these events will be able to participate. Our third outcome here is to make sure that all Gainesvillians will have access to resources that enable continued learning and training. And this really stems from our thinking and discussion around, if we're talking about education, let's think both about public education, but also thinking about how the city's role in expanding and making sure that continued learning opportunities are available to all. And so we have indicators and that talks about employment data, of course, again, broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, level of education and neighborhood, training school completion rates, as well as broadband internet access, which I think a lot of us have recognized the importance of and how critical it is to continued learning and access to education. So some strategies that we have here today are, of course, our partnership in broadband that expands affordable internet access. Also thinking about providing unemployed and underemployed residents with training for industry recognized trades and apprenticeships, providing high school students who want to pursue industry certifications, providing support specifically for residents returning from incarceration and helping them get the training and resources that they need to join the labor force again. Providing free skills training for neighbors experiencing homelessness, as well as any of the wraparound services that will, of course, be necessary for their support. And then a program that's specific to a summer internship program through the city that will engage high school students and college students and youth and get them interested and increase their exposure in local government. So there's a wide variety of programs that are listed here, and we'd love to get your feedback on any of them. I'll keep the screen share up in case any of you would like to jump to specific sections. But we'll, again, give a huge shout out to Nate and Vidal, and I'll open it up for comments and your feedback.
Okay, I don't see any hands up right now. Does anybody have comments on this element? Oh, Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, this is, this, I guess, yeah, to be direct, why we just, and this has to do with the title, how we learn, we just have parentheses, education. I don't know if, is this education and training or education and empowerment? I mean, it seems to me that if we're gonna, have this section, it talks a lot more about, yeah, it's about more than just education. So it seems like, maybe we'd want to, again, if just someone's coming to this document, maybe have a title or a section header that is a little more appropriate to the comprehensiveness of this.
That's a great point. Thank you, Christian. I think we went around a few iterations of titles and subtitles, but I think adding more words that are more descriptive and aligned with the content would be helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I like this section to some extent. That my problem is all of this has a feeling of platitude because it's requires substantial additional funding or redirection of city funding that currently isn't there. And so when we start doing this, I wonder if we lose credibility by saying, yeah, this would be quite the paradise, but what do we do about the funding side of it? On a less pressing notes, I'm not sure I've ever heard of myself as being called a Gainesvillian, and I'm not sure I like it. It sounds like I'm thinking Gainesvilleite, or how about a Gaines villager? I don't know. Gainesvillian just has a sort of reptilian sound to it.
How about swamp denizen?
Well, do you like being called an ACR? That's what the students call us.
Yeah, we didn't know what Gainesvillian was the term that was available to us to use. It reminds me of villains, and I didn't know how to feel about that either. So open to alternative suggestions. And Ari, if there's anything you want to say about a funding piece and the tie between that and the implementation chapter, I'll leave to you.
Yeah, thank you. Equally challenging question. So thank you, Bob. Just on the funding piece, I think that's a great point and ties back to Andrew's point earlier about quick wins and opportunities to align with federal funding. I also think that this is exactly why we need more alignment with comp plan, which is designed and will have these visionary action items and North Stars, but also having strong ties with that and some of the more implementation focused tools that the city has, like the budgeting process, the strategic plan, and all of that. So I think there's a coordination that we need to do once we're in the implementation accountability chapter that makes sure that these are not just aspirational things that may or may not get funded, but these are strong statements about the city's priorities that will then be tied to the budgeting process or other implementing mechanisms.
Okay. Ms. Certain, you had your hand up, but then it dropped. Did that answer your question?
It sort of did. I want to read this a little bit more carefully before I comment and then kind of compare it with what's in our concurrency plan that we have. I think that was Bob who spoke and said there were a lot of platitudes that would require a lot of funding to make them happen. I can kind of see part of that just from skimming it. And then just knowing kind of where we are with locating schools. Right now, I don't see a new school kind of coming into being located within the city limits of Gainesville anytime soon, because we have so many schools with so much capacity in East Gainesville, in the eastern part of the county. when all of the growth, or the majority of the growth, has been in the western part of the county. And so there are some hard decisions that have to be made by a courageous school board to kind of shift the attendance zones eastward to use existing assets that we already have versus building new in the west. So, I won't comment beyond that. I can send any other comments that I have to. I was going to ask who I should send them to if I have something. Send them to Brittany or to who? Who should I send them to if I have any other comments?
I think probably either Brittany or Andrew. Andrew, who would you want the comment sent to?
Yeah, you can send them to both of us, and we'll share them with Lydia and Ari.
Okay, sounds good.
Great, and we appreciate you taking the time to look this over.
Yeah, absolutely.
It looks like Thomas, your hand's up.
I just thought, Madam Chair, thanks. Really quickly, I always thought our demonym was Gainesvillager. I think in writing, Gainesville resident sounds the most professional, for 2 cents. On Bob's comment about this sort of feeling like a wish list, I have the exact same impression. I can't think of anything that I would suggest that we remove, but I think that the City Commission might want to think about what's realistic rather than what's most desired. But that, I think, honestly, that's a policy question that is not, I don't feel like it's in my purview as a plan board member to make those picks. I really think this is not land use policy, right? Most of this is not land use policy. So that's kind of my 2 cents on Bob's comment. Is I agree, but I don't know what to do about it, except be glad I'm not on the City Commission.
And Ari, if you scroll up, we can get over to some of the policies that are more around kind of rules and regulations and allowable uses, which, there, aside from the programs which need funding, there are things that I think are included in here that could be implemented without allocation of additional funds. So I think that's an important piece. And another aspect of this discussion is that the public schools element historically hasn't really included very much sort of substantive action on behalf of the city, because much of the action to be taken is in the power and control of the school board. So this is a little bit about triangulating, where does the city have the power to take action, and how do we broaden this idea of how we learn beyond public schools to also include things like training and job services and other types of pieces that the city can be additive to the existing sort of landscape without stepping over its bounds.
Okay, Christian, your hand's up.
Yeah, I was just going to, and if you guys haven't looked at it, there's a organization called Gainesville for All that's been active the last couple of years, and board member Certain, that's where she was very involved with that early on. And if you haven't, this is also something as a particular kind of outreach effort, they might be a good group to try to sort of get to about this and some other things. And also they've done a lot of brainstorming and facilitation and trying to sort of identify lots of potential things related to sort of education, related to housing, related to transportation. So, again, maybe you've reached out to them and looked at some of their, some of what they've done, but, they've been pretty active around some of these things, and it might be interesting to see their reaction to this and some of the other proposed changes.
Thank you for that suggestion. We actually had very helpful feedback from the group. They were one of the groups that participated in the meetings in a box and shared their feedback directly with us and have been very helpful in informing this effort. So, waiting there.
Great. Do we have anyone on the phone lines for this item?
No, Madam Chair, there is nobody on the line at this time.
Okay. I would just echo, a lot of what we heard about this, looking kind of like a wish list. I found myself sort of marking it up and thinking about, even if we create this office, who do they report to, and what does this fall under, and like, what are the logistics of the city taking on this whole new essentially department. I mean, it's a big undertaking. I don't disagree with any of these suggestions, but I do think that's a big move. I do think, the city's got to think about that budget wise at the same time that they're raising utility rates and raising people's property taxes. I think they're going to get some pushback for, a huge expansion of services. So, that's beyond our purview. Like I said, I don't disagree with any of this, but I just, was scratching my head wondering, how does this all play out, and who gets hired, and who do they report to, and how does this function? When a lot of it, it's almost like a liaison with the school board and other existing entities. It's just the city having their own liaison. So that's my thoughts. Andrew, it looks like your hand is up.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to mention maybe a couple of things that are kind of related to this that are going on in the city. I guess first off, I think all the comments are spot on, and this was very much one of the topics that we had the last time we were before the commission. Some of these ideas were surfaced during that meeting, and there was a lot of debate on the commission about some members of the commission was like, absolutely, this is right where we need to be in terms of providing, the city being more involved in job training. And then there are other members of the commission who are like, I think this is a place where the city should be in a support role, not sort of leading. And there was a lot of back and forth. There are some things that are going on sort of inside of the city related to this. My department has been working over the past year plus on trying to develop an internship program where we would be taking young people who are graduating from high school or are enrolled at Santa Fe and getting them construction trade experience, and then towards a pipeline of becoming building inspectors. That's something that we're just building internal to the city. There is a youth development division or department or office that is currently sort of being thought about in the city that may be a good place to house some of these ideas that are related to getting young people into different job training, job skills programs. So it is I think there is a lot of this stuff that's sort of in the water, but it's not really fully formed yet. And I think to all the comments, I think it's also something that the commission is grappling with right now and figuring out where some of these things that everybody agrees are great things and should be done, sort of where's the best fit, and sort of what's realistic now versus something to be continued sort of to be worked on. So.
Okay, great.
So Ari, I think from our perspective, I wanted to call out specifically, since we've got on the line some folks who have some expertise here on, I think we have one of the strategies, if you could scroll down to the one that's about homeless services, just wanted to call that one out specifically. So Ari, are you able to kind of talk a little bit about some of the back and forth that went into some of the thinking behind how, the comp plan can support those who are experiencing homelessness, or any of the context there, just in case our members on the plan board can weigh in and comment?
Sure, thanks, Lydia. So, and I'll start, and Videz can please chime in. This was part of our discussion that came out of, thinking through how we can expand our thinking around the city's role in supporting different types of people with different backgrounds and experiences continue their education and skills training. And so we wanted to bring a specific call out and a home for strategies that talk to people experiencing homelessness. Understanding that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just job skills that they need support with finding housing and any mental health services, making sure that they are they have all of the support systems that they need in able to feel whole, and then provide to experience job training and skills training. And so understanding that the needs for folks experiencing homelessness are going to be, qualitatively different from, a high school student or people who have homes, and it's going to be different types of needs. So we wanted to house that in a specific strategy, and wanting to, of course, move this forward through partnerships with organizations who are already active in the space, understanding that there are many organizations active in the city of Gainesville who already provide this services. So calling those out, making sure that they are highlighted, and having a home in the comp plan to make sure that the city is moving forward with those partnerships to support people experiencing homelessness. So that's the high level. I know Nate or Videz, if you want to jump in, or Lydia, if there's specific aspects of this that it'll be helpful to talk through further.
Bob, we can go to you. We sort of called this out specifically, sort of understanding you might want to sort of specifically comment on this one.
Well, the city over the last 7 or 8 years, it's been a somewhat arduous process, but in conjunction with the county, and now, quite frankly, mostly the city funding, Grace Marketplace, which was set up originally and is gradually meeting the requirement to actually provide kind of a one-stop basket of services for people in a whole range of situations. It's turned into a very successful and hopefully more successful housing agency. But we also provide, and I'm on the board of Grace and have been almost from the beginning. We provide not only robust housing, permanent supportive housing, to some extent. I think one of the issues that is not well understood or is not wanting to be understood at the big policy level is that a substantial number of people who are homeless have challenges that will probably prevent them from re-entering the job market. And so for those, we do provide mental health services, but we also supply permanent supportive housing. And so when we find housing for people that are not going to probably ever be able to re-enter the workforce, we end up providing them also with a basket of services. We don't just give them a key and help. And the result of that is that we're running at about a 90% retention rate, and we've reduced it a lot. The county's going to a different concept. They actually get the bulk of the funds from the federal government, from HUD, but Grace has managed to establish its expertise and success to the extent that we're now rapidly becoming a magnet for funds for that. And so I appreciate that being in there, but in fact, I think Gainesville has one of the more successful agencies for dealing with this, and hopefully that will continue.
And as we go through this process, if we wanted to include some language in the comp plan that is a support to organizations like Grace Marketplace that can help to solidify, for instance, some of those funding channels that you talked about, that can help to continue to highlight and make the connections between providing services and support to these individuals and families, helps the broader parts of our community and economy. And this is why us working on the transportation side or on other pieces to help out, right, helps. What would you say would be helpful from the standpoint of the power and positioning of a comprehensive plan? Sort of some of it's about land and development, some of it's about rules or funding. What could this document help with?
Well, it's mostly about funding, because it's a little bit of a moving target, meaning the bulk of the funding is tied to the federal government, and they periodically shift gears, which is what they've done the last 5 to 7 years. That being said, Gainesville, not only Grace, but the continuum of care contains about 30 agencies, some small, some large, that have all picked a piece of the homeless issue and deal with it. Some deal with families, some deal with single minor children, unaccompanied minor, things like that. But I do think that it needs to be encourage the concept, but it should not straitjacket the approach, because the approaches will change depending both on funding levels and also the success of what we're doing. Grace started out as an emergency shelter, and the emergency shelter hopefully is not going to grow, and it's rapidly pivoted to being a housing agency.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And for us, the key thing is housing. You begin to solve a lot of problems when people are not living on the street, and that isn't just for the benefit of people who live on the street. It's also a benefit for the merchants that have to deal with people living on the street, the residents who deal with it. It also, I mean, if some of your citizens are living on the street and you have to step over them, it's hard not to think this is a failed system.
Right. And from the standpoint of the city, is there a history of, if most of the HUD money is coming through the county, do you go to the city to ask for anything? What would you ask the city to do to support?
The city currently funds about, it's not quite 40% of Grace. They started funding at a level of $500,000 a year. The county did match that. At some point, the county decided they wanted to go a different direction, and the city replaced that $500,000 that the county dropped out of. And so the city is currently a substantial funder of Grace and a critical funder, and I hope that continues, because quite frankly, whether you use a private entity or a public entity, we're still dealing with the neediest citizens of our community. And that, if that isn't a responsibility for a municipal or county government, I don't know what is. So I think they're meeting their obligation by funding a nonprofit that has grown to be quite skilled at dealing with this. And also, because of the increasing skill level, we're attacked additional funding to make this problem, which, $1 million a year, quite frankly, at this point is not enough money to fund this. Grace's total budget now is about $3.5 million. And we anticipate this year, we're just finishing signing up a grant for another 1.7 million. So Grace, at the point that you begin to have these successes, you also begin to attract additional funding that is not dependent on the taxpayers. But nonetheless, the taxpayers, I think, benefit immensely from this, and they should continue to contribute.
Ari, anything else from your side on that point? I know it was there was some discussion internally about how to provide some language to the comp plan that helps to create that kind of enabling guidance and continue to support these kinds of groups.
I mean, I haven't really read this in detail. I like that it's in there. I think it's an important feature. I think it's if we're talking about equity issues, it's hard pressed to not talk about people's having housing and other fundamental features of urban living, or just living in general, really. But I think it's important that the city recognize that we have a responsibility to do that, and that it's to the benefit of everybody who lives here that we house our neediest citizens in a humane fashion. And also, in conjunction with this whole issue, that allows them to meet their potential.
Mhm.
that they're treated with respect and as normal human beings and with challenges, and that we maximize their ability to enjoy their life and to maximize their potential.
Mm-hmm. And before we move on, I want to call out that this particular topic of conversation, I think it seems obvious, but it'll also show up in our housing, in the housing element, and when we talk about housing policy.
Well, we have a number of people that are far more articulate on this issue than I am. I'm more the bean counter for them, and but we have a very engaged staff that I'm incredibly proud of, and that has learned very rapidly how to deal with a lot of this, and continues to expand the base of knowledge that they have.
Mm-hmm. And to post again for this whole group, the drafts themselves are posted onto our online and interactive site. So there might be an opportunity here for us to send that link over to them if they wanted to say the comp plan, if it could include this piece, what would help us?
I'll make sure that happens.
Badez, I think.
Yeah, it looks like Ms. Massey.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening to everyone. I just wanted to reiterate that in writing the strategies, staff did consider the value in partnering with other organizations. And so the strategies were written so that in most cases, the city wouldn't bear the total responsibility of financing a lot of these endeavors, but would utilize existing partnerships with organizations already in place and expand its partnerships in order to make these strategies come to fruition. So I just wanted to bring that point out.
Thank you. Bob, did you have anything else? Your hand is still up, but.
I'm sorry, that's just because I don't know how this works.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm working on it. There we go. I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. Okay, let's check again if there's anyone on the phone lines before we move on.
Madam Chair, there is no one on the line at this time.
Okay, great. I think with that, we might be ready to move on to the last piece.
Awesome. So I'll take us through our final chapter for this evening, which is our cultural identity chapter. This is a combination of both art and culture, as well as historic preservation. So big shout out to Jason Simmons and Russell Etling for their leadership on this. I'll walk through again at a high level, but of course, please feel free to stop in and explain. And we're really excited for many reasons for this chapter. One big shift that we're moving forward with is to really think of arts and culture and preservation as very interconnected topics. So you'll see this in how we approach combining these two topics in this chapter. I think I personally have enjoyed the very deep discussions between Russell and Jason and thinking through where those intersections are and how racial equity shows up similarly or differently for those two topics. And of course, we've valued a lot of the public input, again, through the listening sessions and the surveys for things, everything from thinking about, what types of organizations that city grants go to, or who attends city programs, or how does historic preservation and the discourse around it include or exclude some folks? Thinking about who gets to define what culture is, or what arts is, or what preservation is, and what holds cultural value. All of these things that I think were form the basis of any type of arts and culture and historic preservation discussions. I think, and our discussions have helped us tie those topics with the question of racial inequity, and how do we talk about how that shows up, racial inequity shows up in those topics of arts and culture. And you'll see that embedded in throughout this chapter, starting with the introduction. So that was a long way of saying I'll walk you through this chapter. So we again start with where we are and how we got here, talking through the city's arts and culture program, as well as the historic preservation discourse at the city, talking through how racial inequity shows up in terms of, for example, who participates in city programs, or the types of relationships that the city already has with some arts organizations versus others, or what types of information regarding city opportunities or grants make it to some arts organizations but do not make it to others. So thinking about really concretely how racial equity shows up or does not show up today. And of course, tying it to historic actions and how decision making around culture and arts and preservation have evolved to manifest those racial inequities that we see today. And of course, there's lots of progress to build on. So we have a robust section on the types of programs that are conducted by the Cultural Affairs Division, as well as the historic preservation area, that all kind of help to reinforce racial equity in the city. So we have a section on this. And then, of course, a brief what's at stake section talking about how representation and racial equity in the context of our cultural identity and how the city defines their cultural identity is a really critical component in thinking through and envisioning a Gainesville that is equitable. So we have our first outcome that talks about primarily arts and culture, making sure that all Gainesville residents are able to enjoy arts as part of their daily life. And neighbors will have access to programming that reflects their identity. And again, this was shaped by a lot of public input that we've heard over the course of the past few months, thinking about really having a sense of belonging at programs that are funded by the city, and really seeing their own identities reflected in the types of programming that are put out by the city. So indicators include things like the percentage of residents who attended a public arts or culture program, the number of types of arts culture programs that are available at low or no cost, understanding that cost may be a barrier to some. And so I won't go through every single one, but some of the strategies that support this outcome talk through growing the arts community overall by strengthening the city's partnerships with arts and community organizations, especially those that are active in communities of color. I'm thinking that those organizations and artists are going to be the trusted partners and the messengers who are going to be critical partners in growing that robust arts community that is inclusive. Take us through the remaining strategies for this outcome. Speaking to barriers that currently exist for artists and art organizations that are seeking to participate in city programs. So talking through how can we make, for example, applications to the city's grant programs more accessible? How can we remove barriers by simplifying the process or making sure that information regarding grants are accessible to organizations? Thinking through expanding cultural offerings at schools and senior centers, making sure that we're reflecting what we've heard about the need for programming that target children as well as seniors in the city. And of course, an important highlight here is to undertake racial equity training for cultural affairs staff as well as arts program and stakeholders. And we're really proud of this strategy, especially because understanding that there needs to be a robust training and discussion for those in the arts community to make sure that everybody's aware of how their expertise and their actions around arts programming could be used to increase racial equity through what they do. And of course, the last strategy under this outcome is to work with community organizations to conduct inclusive outreach to ensure that the city's culture program will reflect Gainesville's diversity of residents. So thinking through the strategies that I've already laid out earlier in this chapter about making sure that engagement is accessible, people are feeling represented, and doing so in partnership with organizations who are active in the space. So our next outcome is focused on historic preservation. So it being historic assets with cultural value are preserved based on community values. And so thinking through what we heard about how does community value get defined, who defines it, who's at the table, and understanding that once buildings, for example, that are deemed as having historic value are then enjoy support from the city or others about grant fundings or others that enable them to be preserved, whereas others who are deemed as not having community values do not enjoy the same level of support. And that leads to a whole other conversation about cultural identity and representation. So the first strategy that we have here is to really expand the definition of historic assets to include buildings and institutions that speak to the social history of communities and hold cultural significance, especially to non-white audiences. And so thinking through in looking at the historic preservation space and the discourse around it, it still remains a very white space. And so thinking about how can we change that narrative and invite other people with other backgrounds and identities in determining how the city defines cultural value and historic significance. And then two other strategies that focus on this outcome, including a strategy that talks about identifying, mapping, and tracking community prioritized properties based on that shared definition of historic value, and to ensure that they are appropriately protected against demolition and adequately maintained. And then lastly, a strategy that talks through developing a plan for a community archive. And this was an idea that we that gained a lot of discussion around our last city commission meeting. But having a role at the city where community voices and testimonials are preserved to make sure that memories and archives that speak to the city's history, and understanding that different audiences will have different memories and histories, but having a place for a home for those memories in the form of oral histories and videos and testimonials, and creating a role for a community librarian who will maintain this archive. So this is all really getting to thinking through how we're defining cultural significance and who holds ownership over how those memories are stored and told through narrative. So that was a high level walkthrough. I'll keep the screen share up, but again, a huge thank you and to Russell and Jason, who are both on this call today. And I'll open it up for questions and comments.
Andrew, did you have something to add?
Yeah, thanks. I did want to add that one of the, I think the sort of pieces of this chapter that is still sort of, I think, being worked on is we just brought on Kathleen Kaufman, who's our brand new preservation officer. Kathleen's got almost 30 years of experience working in preservation here in Florida, and I think has already begun to review the draft. And I think we'll have a lot of really good input to share on it. I think one sort of example of some of the sort of oral history components, we're currently working with the University of Florida and the old Mount Carmel Baptist Church. It's the big brick church in Pleasant Street to prepare architectural and engineering plans to stabilize the building. This is one of the state historic preservation grants that we've done. $10,000 of that $50,000 grant will go towards collecting oral histories about the church, and specifically its prominence in the civil rights movement here in Gainesville. So some of that kind of collection of really just kind of city history that is not written down is, I think, part of the strategy that we're sort of thinking about with this this piece of it. But I think some of this will be continually kind of being worked on in the next few weeks as Kathleen comes on board and gets up to speed.
Great. Yeah, I couldn't help but think, especially with the last item, I don't know if that wholly belongs on the city's shoulders. I mean, UF has a number of programs. They have an oral history program. There's the Matheson Museum, has so many local historical resources. I don't know if that has to live with the city or if it's more of a partnership with, existing groups and using the university and things. Again, like sort of creating new positions and, if this community librarian lives within planning, if it's another hat that the historical preservation planner has to wear, they already have a lot of work to do. So I think that that's one that's sort of, similar to some of the issues we brought up earlier with like a new department for some of the education and learning tasks. This is one I think that maybe working in partnership might be a better idea because I think some of those resources exist in the community, and there are a lot of programs at UF that I think would be on board with helping pull this together.
And just to bring up, I think Ari might have alluded to this. That one in particular came from the commission, where in recognition that UF houses some of that oral history sort of through their existing program. Our guidance was to include one that would be run and managed by the city. So we can, again, kind of go back and forth of their direction on that point of where would we carve out a role for the city versus not.
That's great. We can, they're going to get pushed back on some of this, I think. We can't just keep spending and spending and spending, but. Or maybe they can.
Any other questions or comments on this one? I think this historic preservation element in particular will be one of those areas where there's a lot of sort of direct connections to land and development in particular too, in terms of the ways that preservation, shows up today and how it could show up in the future if we're broadening some of the definitions for what we're qualifying as historically significant. So sort of imagine or look forward to hearings from some of those discussions in the future as we come back with some of that more specific guidance and language in those appendices or wherever those policies might lie. But any other kind of comments, questions, reactions to what's currently in the draft today? Okay. Any comments or questions from our folks, our staff who's on the line, or from Andrew and Eric about this chapter, or else feels like we made good time and got through our agenda items?
Yeah, let's check the phone lines one more time too. Do we have anyone on the phone?
How about that? No, Madam Chair, there's nobody on the lines at this time.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions, comments from board members or staff?
And I just broaden also to say, now that you've seen some of the commentary across a subset of the chapters, just to broaden our conversation a little bit, any other sort of thoughts about, where we started with this conversation, which is about the direction, overall tone, overall structure of this whole document as it comes together? Now that we've gone through, obviously welcome your comments at any time or now.
Not yet.
I think my general concerns are around potentially biting off more than we can chew here. And I think the city commission, this is their direction, but I think they may be biting off more than they can chew. So, I think there's a lot of great things. But as far as, funding and personnel and resources, I don't know that we're going to be successful in all of it.
Well, and I think we squander our credibility when we reach way beyond our ability. And I don't know if we are or not, but I do think that we end up being empty platitudes if in fact we can't achieve substantial parts of what we're going to write in this document.
Thomas, did you have other thoughts?
I'd reiterate the point that I made earlier, that to the extent that some strategies lend themselves to providing specific directions for when the city is going to issue permits or not issue permits, we should strive to include that language. And certainly, if we're going to strike any language that has that character from the current plan, we should be thoughtful about each such policy we strike, and just so those things don't slide under the rug. But I was use this opportunity to say I'm proud of the city commission for being as bold as it has been, and for staff for carrying it through, and for y'all for coming and learning so much about Gainesville during a pandemic.
Thank you for that. Okay. Any last words from Andrew?
No, I think to reiterate what I said in the beginning, I think it's, I've been with the city for a decade. I've done, worked on the last comprehensive plan, worked on other comprehensive plans for other local governments. I'm really feel very privileged to be able to be working on this one. I think it's really exciting. It's also, bold, and that also comes with some risk. But I think that's where we are as a community, as a country. I think this is the time to be bold. I understand, I think some of the commentary about sort of biting off more than we can chew. And there's definitely days where I'm like, that's what it feels like. But I don't know what the alternative is. I don't think that from the commission standpoint, they want, a sort of middle of the road approach with this. And I'm not sure that if we don't take some bold action, that anything's going to change. So I think as city staff, I'm really proud of all the work that's gone in, and all the really creative ideas that I think have come forward. I think going into this, none of us were quite sure. We're kind of building the airplane as we were flying it, but it's coming together, and I could see, a lot of the contours coming into focus, and I'm excited about what I see so far. So I appreciate you guys keeping an open mind and listening and being thoughtful about your comments and reading through everything. And I'm excited to have subsequent conversations with you, which is all to say that we'll be reaching out for some board dates for the next workshop. So
Great. Thank you all. And we will see you again, I think sometime next month. They're looking to have another workshop. So, I think you've done a lot of great work so far. We look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good